Now, this may surprise you, but some people say, Owen, you know sweet F.A. about what you are talking about. And you probably know what the F and the A stand for. It's probably ticking over in your mind, so I apologise for that. Yet, what's lesser known is that the original expression, the F and the A, came from a name, Fanny Adams. So the expression started as Sweet Fanny Adams, meaning nothing, something of no significance at all. But what is even lesser known then about this common expression that's used today is that Fanny Adams was a real person. So we're going to see how that particular expression has just come into the general vernacular. But firstly, we need to know who she was and what happened to her. Now, before we go any further, I will say this one is horrific. We will be talking about some very heavy topics throughout all of this. So if you are triggered by disturbing things, then this may not be the video for you. Just due warning. So who was Fanny Adams? Let's put it to the pub test. Now we have to go back to 1867 in Alton, Hampshire. Now you've heard the expression, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, this was that village. It was small. Everybody knew everybody, and as a result, they hardly had any crime. So it was a place where your kids could go out and just play, knowing that they're going to be home sometime before dark, because that was probably the only rule they had. So what happened in this afternoon came as a total shock to the community. 3 young girls, Minnie and her 2 friends, Lizzie and Fanny Adams, went out to play. When it was time to start coming home, it was only Lizzie and Minnie that returned. So one of the ladies from the village noticed this and said, where's your sister, Lizzie? She said, she's still back in the hop field where we were playing. The neighbour is concerned, goes to Harriet Adams, the mother of Lizzie and Fanny, and says, Fanny's not with these girls. They are concerned. They start marching off to the hop fields where she was last seen. They run into a bloke who was new to town. Now, he wasn't a total stranger, but he had been in town only 2 months. He had been attending the church. So they did know of this bloke, and it was said that he was a tiny bit eccentric. But, just because you're eccentric doesn't mean you're going to cause harm. Now, we have to understand their view in accord with 1867 eyes. What I will describe now about this man, Frederick Baker, would put you on a bit of a predator list in today's times. Because I said he liked to hang around with the kids. He was known to give the kids some money for lollies. Now in 2025, you'd probably be plastered all over social media saying keep away from this bloke. But not back then. There was no real alarm raised. But because Minnie and Lizzie had said the last person they saw Fanny Adams with was Frederick Baker, Harriet and her neighbour see him as they're heading out to the hop fields, and they confront him and say, "What have you done with Fanny?" And he goes, "Nothing." Now, either Lizzie or Minnie piped up at this point because they're there, and one of them said, "Well, you gave us some pennies to buy lollies." And he goes, "No, I didn't. I gave you 3 or 3p. Regardless, he wasn't denying that he was there, and he wasn't also denying that he gave these girls money. He just said, "Look, I don't know what you're talking about though, and I'm off." And so then Harriet says, "I might send you off to the police." And he goes, "Look, you can do what you like." That's not a problem. In fact, if they're looking for me, I'll be at that lawyer's office. That's where I work. And he was cool, calm, and collected. He wasn't concerned at all that Fanny Adams had gone missing. But what was odd is he did spend some time down there with these girls. He was picking blackberries or blueberries and giving them to these girls. But without any real knowledge of what had happened to this young girl yet, Frederick Baker just walks off and goes back to work. Well, the search begins. And this is where we really start to get into the disturbing aspect of this story. But they find Fanny Adams' head basically on a pike in the hop field. And her eyes had been removed. So now, Harriet is beside herself with grief, not just because she now knows her daughter has passed away, but the horrific nature of this attack. And it doesn't get any better. But George, Harriet's husband, Fanny's father, he's off playing a game of cricket. Now, if you are not from the Commonwealth areas of the world and you don't understand cricket, cricket is an all-day thing, sometimes a 5-day thing. So it's not that he was off in the pub just drinking with his mates, but he's there playing cricket all day. They have to send a message to him to come home. He reacts quite rationally, quite calmly, and says, look, Harriet, this is a tragedy, but let's just have a cup of tea and think about this. Well, absolutely not. He does not do that. He goes, you know what? Let's go find that blood jar. Gets the shotgun. It takes the village to talk him down. Now, I would suggest two things here. That, yes, they did the right thing by stopping him from doing that, though he probably never would have been charged for a crime by finding Frederick Baker and shooting him. But what possibly would have happened is questions would have remained. Was it Frederick Baker who committed this crime? Was an innocent person executed for what happened here? Remembering, in this village, everyone knew everyone. And as we know with many crimes, we do not want to believe that it could be a local that could commit such a heinous act. It would have to be someone from the outside. So the natural target would be Frederick Baker. But during the search, they find parts of Fanny Adams' body strewn everywhere. They literally sew the body parts back together and get George in to identify the body. I have no idea how, as a parent, you would be able to stomach that. But yeah, he does go in and say, yeah, that definitely is my daughter. So now attention turns to Frederick Baker as the only suspect in this crime, because he had the means. He had the opportunity. We have no idea about motive. So attention turns to Frederick Baker. Now, I will be breaking down all of these claims very shortly when we get to the trial, because yes, he is arrested. But he was not helping himself, let's put it that way. So he's sitting in a pub drinking with one of his work colleagues. And this work colleague says, look, he was always a bit odd. But he'd only been in town 2 months. So people's impression of this bloke really, obviously it was the first impression and it stuck. But they're sitting there having a drink. And interestingly, Minnie and Lizzie, the other two girls, had said that they thought Frederick Baker was probably already drunk in the afternoon when they were down in the hop field. How accurate that is, I don't know, because we know in today's times you really don't trust the testimony of younger kids, because their descriptions can get influenced by what the adults and what other people are saying. But regardless, he was known to be on the drink a little bit. So he's in there slamming a few down. And he says to his mate, look, if they find this girl dead, it's not going to work out well for me. And his mate's like, well, what do you mean? He goes, well, I was last seen with them. So yeah, I think that's a fair concern that you would have. But then he says, look, I think I might have to leave town on Monday. Better get out. And he goes, well, his mate says, well, what are you going to do when you go? He goes, well, maybe I could take up as a butcher. Now, knowing the scene that was found, that is very, very disturbing. The police go to his office and to his house. They find in his diary entry for that day the expression, killed girl, fine, it was fine and hot. That is also very disturbing. They find small knives with blood on them, and they look at his clothing, and there's a couple of small, very small blood stains. And his trousers were a bit damp. So they bring him in and say, you better start telling the story of what you did. And he says, I didn't do it. I am totally innocent. So they stage an inquest, and this inquest is held at one of the local pubs, and you think, well, that's a bit weird, but back then, no, it wasn't. You needed a large hall. Not every little place had one, but the pub would accommodate enough people. So that actually wasn't all that weird. In fact, where they did autopsies and everything would sometimes be on people's kitchen tables. Like that was just the stock standard procedure of what happened back in those days. But at this inquest, it's determined that Fanny Adams met her demise at the hands of Frederick Baker. So he is now put on trial. Well, this seems like a very open and shut case. But let me take the defense side, because he does get a decent defense lawyer. So just consider yourself on the jury, and I'm presenting some evidence to you. Because right now, I think you know whether or not this bloke's guilty. You're going to say yes. But I put to you the knife that was found. It was a small knife. The atrocity that happened to this young girl was absolutely brutal. We're talking total dismemberment, organs removed. Could not have been done with this little knife. And the police know that. And they never, ever find the actual knife that was used in the attack. Remember too, the blood found on the little knife that they found and the blood on his clothes, well, they couldn't do any blood matching. And you have to understand that people didn't wash their clothes every day back then, because that was quite a considerable effort to do so. And so that blood could have come from anywhere. Could have come from a small nosebleed. Who knows? That is not definitively proven that that was the blood of Fanny Adams. The diary entry is interesting because there was no comma after it said killed girl and then comma, fine and hot. It was just one full sentence. And he said, Frederick Baker, look, I was just writing down what happened in the day. That a girl was killed and the weather was fine and hot. Not saying that I did it. Now, I understand that if you saw how I do these videos and the notes I do have notes. I'm not just freewheeling here, standing in front of a microphone going on about things. I do have a bit of an outline just so I can keep my thoughts in track. And so if something happened around my town and they came and saw some of my notes, they might think, yeah, you've got some weird stuff going on there, Owen. Because I do have little sentences like that. Killed girl. But to me, that then triggers going, that was the girl that was killed, and then I've got my prompt to start speaking about it. So I get what he's saying there, even though it doesn't look very good. Now, his demeanor, even when he was approached by Harriet and the neighbour, just wasn't one of concern. Like, you would think if you had just committed that crime and you've now been approached by two of the little girls you were playing with and the mother of the victim, you would find it really hard to be that controlled. You might be a little bit cagey to say, well, I wasn't even down there. You'd probably run for your life. Like, you get away from that situation and not sit at the pub drinking with your mate. No, you'd be gone. So the fact that he didn't run, that also raises just some very interesting questions. Now, even when he said to the bloke at the pub, look, I might go and become a butcher. Look, that sense of humour, well, we're going to look at that type of sense of humour that was around back then. And look, I understand it. As Australians, we have that sort of sense of humour as well. Whether it comes from the fact that, the England sent out all the convicts to Australia and so we've sort of picked that up, I don't know. But again, in itself, it is not something that would hang a bloke. And in fact, he even said, Frederick Baker that is, when he was being investigated, they said, well, we found some blood on your clothes. He goes, well, that's not going to hang me, is it? And people say, well, that sort of suggests guilt. But back then, justice moved very, very quickly. And so, rightfully, he was concerned. Now, the defence did bring all this up. So what are you thinking now? Do you feel that it was just bad circumstance for Frederick Baker? That the local people couldn't believe that it was one of them that could have committed this crime. But this eccentric bloke who's now turned up to church a few times, like he's at church every week, I should say, well, he had to have been the one. He's the only outsider, and he was definitely with these girls. So it has to be him. Is this a total stitch-up? Well, if I have put some doubt in your mind about his guilt, what his defence lawyer does next must just be considered a total clown show. For whatever reason, and let me tell you, the police case was that flimsy it could have fallen over at any moment. Any pieces of those evidence I've just presented, I believe, would raise reasonable doubt in people's mind. So when the defence lawyer brings in Frederick Baker's family, that just wasn't good. Because now we hear of Frederick Baker's mental health problems. He tried to take his own life apparently 2 years before. His cousin had been locked up in an asylum for the insane. And back then, they thought that ran in the family. So if you had a family member who was in a mental asylum, well, then you were probably crazy too. They bring up his father is on the stand, and he's not a nice bloke. Apparently, he was prone to a bit of violence and just wasn't a decent human being as well. And he's testifying for his son, saying, yeah, my son's got some issues as well. And Frederick Baker's sister gets up and says, yeah, no, Fred Egan sometimes snap, just gets prone to random acts of violence. And this is the defense. And the defense lawyer at the end of the trial says, you should find my client not guilty, but if you do think he's guilty, then he's guilty by reason of insanity. So, was this lawyer totally hopeless? Well, I'm going to say no. And for this reason, I would have done exactly the same thing as that lawyer. He was a very good lawyer. And there's no doubt that Frederick Baker did this crime. He is the lowest form of human being you can get. And I know some will argue that people have done a lot worse crimes. That possibly is true. But there's a base level that humanity sometimes hit, and you can't get below that. So he is down there with all those debased, low-life humans. And so if I had to take on that case, I probably could raise reasonable doubt, but then I would make sure that the right verdict was given. And you'll say, Owen, how are you so sure? Well, I'm going to bring that out a little bit later as to why I know justice was done in this case, because the jury took 15 minutes and they found him guilty. And he was sentenced to be executed, and that was going to happen on Christmas Eve of 1867. So yes, justice moved very swiftly. It said that he gave a confession and wrote a confession letter that was handed to George and Harriet Adams. And it said that after reading that letter, they forgave him. Which, I mean, obviously they weren't then trying to protest saying don't execute him, but in their heart, apparently they could let go of the resentment toward him. Never been in that situation myself, so, we all act differently, but, more power to them for being able to have that capacity to do so. But this execution was, because this story had hit national press. It was huge news. So people travelled from everywhere to this small village in Hampshire to watch the execution of Frederick Baker, and the majority of people in the audience were women. And probably because of the way many women were treated back then, seeing justice done for once was probably something you wanted to go and see. But what evidence do I have to show that the right person was convicted? Considering everything was rather circumstantial, they had no real concrete evidence. Well, a couple of things. Firstly, that diary note that he put in there. When that was written, it wasn't known what had happened to Fanny Adams. Only someone with the knowledge of the crime would have known that Fanny was no longer alive. And also, his demeanour, while some people point to that as being innocent, if you'd been in a small town for 2 months, you've gone to church for that 2 months, you've been playing with these girls, if they've gone missing, one of them's gone missing, what would be your first reaction? We better go find them. Not, if you want me, I'll be back at work. That doesn't pass the pub test. But what is odd, and it does raise a very intriguing thought, how did he not have physical evidence on him, considering what he did to that poor girl? Like an expert because this was part of the defense, I didn't bring this up before, but an expert testified that someone without prior experience could have dismembered a body in less than half an hour and positioned themselves in a way where they wouldn't get blood all over them. I don't know what expert that is, but I think you'd have to be fairly skilled, and you'd have to have a fair bit of knowledge about what you're doing to be able to do it. And so my point here is, for Frederick Baker, this was not his first dance. He, no doubt, in my mind at all, was probably a brutal serial killer of young kids. And I believe I have evidence to prove that. Firstly, he was only in town for 2 months, and no one really knows what he was doing the 2 months prior to arriving into town. There's no history, really. And back then, there wasn't social media. There wasn't the police all interconnected. You could, as was discussed in a prior video about Joseph Vacher, the French Ripper, he could go from village to village, and the police from the village prior had no idea about him. And it actually changed how police started communicating that particular case over in France, which led to the more interconnecting of police forces around the world, because they realised we've got to share knowledge. Well, he could have been going from town to town committing these crimes. And I did a bit of research and found 5 unsolved child slayings very similar to this prior to 1867. Between 1861 and 1867, Frederick Baker was 29 years old at the time of his execution. He would have been in his 20s when these happened. And that's just the 5 I've found, because many of these crimes were never really reported, or at least have been lost to history. So what was the true extent of his crimes? See, in his confession, he didn't write everything in the letter to the parents. He said to the chaplain that he'd carried Fanny Adams' heart around for a while and someone saw him and he then dropped it into the river. That is the hallmark of a genuine psychopath. And as they say, you don't always get what you want, but hopefully you get what you deserve. I'm not debating the capital punishment, but I would suggest in this case, Frederick Baker got what he deserved. But then that leads to the legacy of Sweet Fanny Adams. Yes, that was in the British Navy. They started giving the sailors tinned mutton. And apparently they said this mutton was bad. Now, I don't know how you can tell if tinned meat's bad, because I think it's pretty much bad all the time. But the dark humour that comes from, sailors, they said, well, this is a tin of Fanny Adams. Yeah, basically they've collected her remains and put them in a tin. And then that slowly started changing to Sweet Fanny Adams, meaning nothing. And interestingly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe that the trays that sailors are still given in the British Navy are known as fannies from this particular story. But then that expression jumped into the general population, and then people would just say, oh, that's Sweet Fanny Adams, meaning nothing of consequence. And then slowly the F and the A get shortened to what it is now. And many people say, well, that is absolutely horrific that this particular story of one young 8-year-old girl and the way she met the end of her life was so terrible and she's remembered as nothing. I take a slightly different view, because without that bit of dark humour, this story might have been lost to history too. We may not even know about it. And as I understand, in that small village, even today, there is still a plaque and a monument to young Fanny Adams. So next time someone says, Sweet F.A., well, you can say, well, I'm guaranteeing you do not know what you are talking about, and let me tell you the story. But thank you so much for watching. It genuinely is appreciated. This was a difficult one to cover, having to look at the story and putting yourself there in the parents' space. That's rather confronting when you think if you had to deal with that situation, it would not be a nice thing to do at all. I think we can appreciate that. But moving forward here at the Pub Test, I'm going to do a series where a writer reads his book. I'm going to start reading Corporate Jungle, and I'm going to get the first 6 chapters out fairly quickly. So if it's not for you, don't worry, you don't have to watch those videos, but some people enjoy it. So it might be a different audience coming into the Pub Test just to check that out. And hey, everyone's all welcome. But I am working on some very intriguing videos coming up. I'm just fine-tuning some evidence and details to make sure that these videos will be very accurate, but I think you'll be intrigued with some of the information that is being brought to my attention. So make sure you keep an eye out for those videos coming out soon. So if this is what you are interested in, make sure you give that like button a hit. Give us a subscribe as well. And thank you all for being part of this journey on the Pub Test. I'm Owen. You've been watching the Pub Test, and we'll see you on the next one.